The morning sun had barely peeked through the windows of Chicago O'Hare International Airport when the crew of Flight 237 gathered for their pre-flight briefing. Among them was Mrs. Thompson, a flight attendant who had called the skies her office for the past 17 years. Her crisp navy blue uniform and perfectly pinned hair spoke of someone who took immense pride in her appearance and position. To her fellow crew members, she was known as someone who ran her cabin section like a military operation. Everything had to be just so: tray tables perfectly aligned, seat belts neatly crossed, and not a single wrapper in sight. Her colleagues often joked that you could eat off the cabin floor after one of her flights, though few found her obsession with order endearing. What most people didn't see was how differently she treated certain passengers. It was subtle at first, a slightly colder tone here, an extra scrutinizing glance there. Over the years, these small biases had grown like weeds in an untended garden, taking root so deeply that she no longer noticed them herself. This particular Monday morning was already off to a rough start. Dark clouds loomed over the airport, promising the kind of weather that gives pilots headaches and passengers anxiety. The flight had already been delayed by 2 hours, and the terminal was packed with frustrated travelers who had been waiting since dawn. Mrs. Thompson stood at the customer service desk, her fingers drumming an irritated rhythm on the counter as she watched the delay time increase yet again. "Another 30 minutes, she muttered, knowing this would mean even more complaints, more demands, and more entitled passengers trying to upgrade their seats. Back in the crew room, she overheard conversations about a big science competition happening in Atlanta, their destination city. Apparently, several students would be on board, traveling to present their projects. The mere thought of dealing with teenagers on an already stressful flight made her jaw clench. "Remember when we used to love turbulent days?" her co-worker asked, trying to lighten the mood. Made the job more exciting. But Mrs. Thompson barely cracked a smile. Over the years, something had changed in her. The joy of flying, the thrill of meeting new people, the satisfaction of helping others. It had all been replaced by a rigid need for control and an unconscious tendency to judge passengers before they even spoke their first word. As she reviewed the passenger manifest, she noted the various seat assignments with her usual attention to detail. The first-class cabin was full of business travelers, the kind she preferred, usually quiet, predictable, and low maintenance. But the economy section was a different story, filled with families, students, and budget travelers who, in her experience, always seemed to need something. What Mrs. Thompson didn't realize was that this ordinary Monday flight would become anything but ordinary. In just a few hours, her carefully constructed world of rules and prejudices would be challenged in ways she never expected. The brewing storm outside was nothing compared to the storm that was about to unfold at 35,000 feet. As passengers began boarding, she stood at her usual post, greeting them with what she considered a professional smile, though it never quite reached her eyes. She was particularly watchful today, her mood already soured by the delays and the weather. Little did she know, her next interaction would not only go viral, but would force her to confront the very biases she had spent years denying. The boarding process continued, and with each passing minute, the tension in her shoulders grew tighter. Sometimes, the weight of carrying around so many preconceptions and judgments can be exhausting, though Mrs. Thompson would never admit that to herself. Not yet, anyway. But soon, very soon, everything she thought she knew about herself and her job would be put to the test in the most public way possible. The flight had been in the air for about 30 minutes when a young high school student made his way down the aisle. He was carrying a laptop bag and a folder filled with papers that kept threatening to spill out. Despite the early hour, he was dressed formally in a pressed white shirt and dark blue pants, clearly making an effort to look professional. "Excuse me," he said softly, approaching Mrs. Thompson. His voice was polite but slightly nervous, the way most teenagers sound when they have to talk to authority figures. "I noticed there's an empty seat near the power outlet in premium economy." I have a really important presentation to work on, and my laptop's running low on battery. Would it be possible to move there? Just until I can charge my computer." Mrs. Thompson's reaction was immediate and harsh. Her eyes narrowed, and her lips pressed into a thin line. "Let me see your boarding pass," she demanded, her voice carrying through the cabin much louder than necessary. Several passengers looked up from their books and screens, startled by her tone. The student fumbled with his folder, carefully pulling out his boarding pass. His hands were trembling slightly, but he maintained his composure. "Here it is," he said, still keeping his voice respectful. "I know it's not my assigned seat, but since it's empty." "Do you think this is how it works?" Mrs. Thompson cut him off, waving the boarding pass in the air. "People can't just wander around the plane sitting wherever they please. This isn't a public bus." Her voice dripped with condescension and something else. Something uglier that made nearby passengers shift uncomfortably in their seats. The young man tried to explain again. "I understand, ma'am. It's just for the presentation. I'm headed to the national science competition, and I really need to review my slides." His voice trailed off as Mrs. Thompson's expression grew even sterner. "A likely story," she scoffed, looking him up and down with obvious skepticism. "I've heard every excuse in the book. Next, you'll be telling me you're giving a speech at the White House." Several passengers gasped at her sarcastic tone and obvious implications. The student stood there, clutching his laptop bag closer, his earlier confidence wilting under her harsh scrutiny. The folder in his hands now had slight creases where his fingers gripped it too tightly. Inside were months of research, carefully prepared slides, and a project that could help him secure a college scholarship. Not that Mrs. Thompson cared to ask. "I can show you my competition ID," he offered quietly, reaching for his wallet. But Mrs. Thompson had already turned to address other passengers, making a show of checking their seat assignments, as if to catch other potential seat hoppers. "Everyone needs to remain in their assigned seats," she announced loudly. "We can't have people moving around, claiming empty seats that they haven't paid for. It's against policy." She emphasized the word policy while staring pointedly at the student. By now, several passengers had pulled out their phones, some discreetly recording, others typing furiously, probably sharing the unfolding scene on social media. The student remained standing in the aisle, caught in an impossible situation, his face showing a mix of embarrassment and resignation that no young person should have to experience. A businessman who had witnessed the entire exchange checked his own laptop battery and charger, visibly troubled by what he was seeing. A mother covered her young daughter's ears, shaking her head in disapproval at Mrs. Thompson's behavior. The tension in the cabin was becoming thick enough to cut with a knife. Mrs. Thompson seemed oblivious to the mounting disapproval around her. She was too focused on what she saw as a violation of rules, too caught up in her own prejudices to notice how her behavior was affecting not just the student, but everyone around her. In her mind, she was simply doing her job, maintaining order, but the phones recording the scene told a different story, one that would soon be shared with millions. Little did she know, her next actions would not only change the course of this flight, but would become a turning point in her life. Though not in the way she might have expected. The storm clouds outside the plane window seemed to darken, as if nature itself was responding to the growing tension in aisle 3 of Flight 237. The situation in the aircraft cabin was getting worse by the minute. The young student, still standing in the aisle, pulled out his competition badge and documents with shaking hands. "Look, here's all the proof," he said quietly. "I really am going to the national science competition. My project is about developing a more affordable water filtration system for communities in need." But Mrs. Thompson wasn't interested in proof. Something had snapped inside her, as if this simple request had unleashed years of hidden prejudices. "Put those away," she said sharply. "I don't need to see any more of your papers. Return to your assigned seat immediately, or I'll have to take further action." A middle-aged woman in a business suit 2 rows ahead couldn't stay quiet any longer. "He's just asking to charge his laptop," she said. "There are 3 empty seats in premium economy. What's the real problem here?" Mrs. Thompson turned to the woman with a practiced customer service smile that didn't match her cold eyes. "Ma'am, I'm simply enforcing airline policy. We can't have passengers moving between cabins. It's a security issue." "Security issue?" Another passenger spoke up, his voice heavy with disbelief. "I've been flying this airline for 20 years. Just last week, a flight attendant let me move to an empty row to work on my laptop." The young student tried one more time. "I can show you my presentation right now," he offered. "It's all ready on my laptop. I just need about 30 minutes to charge it and review." "That's enough." Mrs. Thompson's voice rose sharply. "Return to your seat now, or I'll have to call the captain about a disruptive passenger." The cabin erupted in murmurs of disapproval. More phones appeared, recording everything. A young mother comforted her crying child, who had been startled by the flight attendant's harsh tone. The business travelers exchanged knowing looks. They'd seen this kind of behavior before, but rarely so blatant. Disruptive. A gentleman in a suit stood up. "The only disruption here is coming from you, ma'am. This young man has been nothing but polite. I'm writing to customer service as we speak." Mrs. Thompson's face flushed red. She reached for the cabin phone, her hand trembling slightly. "If everyone doesn't settle down and return to their assigned seats, I'll have to report this as a security incident. We could be forced to make an emergency landing." The threat hung in the air like a dark cloud. The student, looking defeated, began to turn back toward his seat. His shoulders were slumped, and the competition papers he'd been so proud of were now crumpled in his grip. But fate had other plans. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, causing the overhead lights to flicker. In that brief moment of darkness, something changed in the cabin. When the lights came back on, dozens of passengers had their phones out, recording. Some were already posting on social media, their fingers flying across their screens as they described what they were witnessing. A kind-looking elderly gentleman in the front row spoke up, his voice carrying the weight of wisdom. "Young man," he called out, "I have a power bank you can borrow. And I'd love to hear about your water filtration project while you work on your presentation." This simple act of kindness seemed to break something in Mrs. Thompson. She stood there, watching as other passengers began offering their own chargers and power banks. The community of strangers was coming together, united against what they recognized as a clear injustice. The businessman who had spoken earlier was now on his phone, apparently talking to someone important. "Yes, I'm witnessing it right now," he said clearly. "This needs immediate attention from your corporate office." Mrs. Thompson suddenly realized she was no longer in control of the situation. The very order she had tried so desperately to maintain was crumbling around her, replaced by something far more powerful: human decency and solidarity. The videos were already spreading across the internet like wildfire, and her world was about to change forever. The young scientist stood in the aisle, surrounded by unexpected support from strangers, his story becoming a symbol of something much bigger than a simple request to charge a laptop. Meanwhile, the plane continued its journey through the stormy skies, carrying not just passengers, but a situation that was about to become a viral moment in the ongoing conversation about bias and basic human dignity. Just as the tension reached its peak, a woman in her mid-50s stood up from her seat in row 12. She wore a simple blazer and carried herself with quiet confidence. "I think this has gone far enough," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I'm a child psychologist with 30 years of experience, and what I'm witnessing here is textbook discriminatory behavior." The cabin fell silent. Even the usual airplane white noise seemed to dim. Mrs. Thompson's face flickered between anger and uncertainty as the psychologist approached. "Let's break this down," the psychologist continued, addressing everyone in the cabin. "We have a young student, traveling alone, politely requesting to use an empty seat near a power outlet for his academic work. He's shown his documentation, maintained his composure despite provocation, and offered multiple solutions. The only variable here seems to be, she paused meaningfully, letting everyone fill in the blank themselves. The business travelers who had been typing on their phones now looked up. One of them spoke directly to Mrs. Thompson. "I'm on the board of directors for an educational foundation," he said. "We sponsor students for this exact science competition. Would you like me to verify this young man's story with the organization right now?" Mrs. Thompson's hands began to shake slightly as she gripped her serving card. This isn't about. I'm just following protocol," she stammered, but her voice had lost its earlier authority. A flight attendant from first class had made her way back to see what was causing the commotion. Her eyes widened as she took in the scene. Dozens of phones recording, angry passengers, and her colleague backed against the serving cart. "I can handle this," the other flight attendant said softly to Mrs. Thompson. Turning to the student, she smiled warmly. "Sir, there are actually 2 empty seats in the front row of premium economy. Our airline's policy does allow seat changes at the crew's discretion, especially for academic or business needs. Would you like me to show you to one of those seats?" The psychologist nodded approvingly, but wasn't finished. "Before we move forward," she said, "I think it's important to acknowledge what's really happening here. I've spent my career helping young people deal with the trauma of prejudice. What might seem like a small incident to some can have lasting effects on a young person's self-worth and confidence." The cabin hummed with murmurs of agreement. A young teacher in row 15 raised her hand. "As an educator, I see the impact of these small incidents every day in my classroom. They add up. They leave scars. And they're exactly what we should be fighting against, not perpetuating." Mrs. Thompson's face had gone pale. The carefully constructed walls of her professionalism were crumbling as the truth of her actions became impossible to ignore. She watched as the kind flight attendant helped the student gather his materials and led him toward the empty premium economy seat. An elderly couple who had been quietly observing everything turned to each other. "Remember when we were young?" The wife whispered to her husband, but loud enough for those nearby to hear. How different things could have been if more people had spoken up back then. The psychologist turned her attention back to Mrs. Thompson, her voice gentler now. "The beautiful thing about moments like these is that they offer us a chance to learn and grow. The question is, are we willing to take that opportunity?" The phones were still recording, capturing every word. Someone mentioned that the airline's customer service team was already responding to posts about the incident on social media. The world beyond the airplane walls was watching, waiting to see how this would end. As the student settled into his new seat, plugging in his laptop with slightly trembling hands, various passengers approached to offer encouragement. A retired professor 2 rows behind him leaned forward. "When you present your water filtration project," he said warmly, "remember this moment. Remember how many strangers stood up for what was right." The plane's cabin had transformed from a place of conflict into something else. A community of people who had witnessed something important and chosen to act. For Mrs. Thompson, standing rigid and alone by her serving cart, it was the beginning of a very different journey than the one she expected when she arrived at work that morning. While the young student tried to focus on his presentation in his new seat, the ripple effects of what had just happened were already spreading beyond the airplane's walls. At 35,000 feet, airplane Wi-Fi was carrying dozens of video clips to social media platforms, where they were spreading like wildfire. A college student in row 20 glanced at her phone and whispered to her seatmate, "The first video already has 50,000 views, and it's only been up for 20 minutes." She turned her screen to show the growing number of comments and shares. The hashtag flight attendant bias was trending, along with the airline's name. The student scientist kept his eyes fixed on his laptop screen, trying to ignore the occasional whispers and glances in his direction. His hands still trembled slightly as he clicked through his presentation slides about the water filtration system. A kind grandmother sitting next to him offered him a bottle of water. "You're doing great," Honey, she said softly, just focus on your project now. Back in the main cabin, Mrs. Thompson had retreated to the galley area, her face ashen. The other flight attendant was handling drink service, while concerned passengers continued to discuss what they'd witnessed. The business traveler who'd been on the phone earlier was now showing his seatmate something on his screen. Look at this, he said, pointing to his phone. The airline's CEO just posted a statement. We are aware of the incident on Flight 237 and are taking this matter very seriously. This behavior does not reflect our values. His voice trailed off as he continued reading. The psychologist who had intervened earlier was now quietly speaking with other passengers, many of whom were sharing their own experiences with similar situations. It's important that we document this, she explained. Not to punish, but to create awareness and change. A young software engineer raised his hand to share. I was in a science competition last year as a judge, he said. You wouldn't believe how many brilliant young minds get discouraged because of moments exactly like this. But this time, it's different. This time, we have proof. The plane hit another patch of turbulence, and the seatbelt sign dinged on. As passengers buckled up, a flight tracking app notification popped up on several phones. Flight 237 trending on social media. The story was taking on a life of its own. In premium economy, the student had finally managed to get through a complete run-through of his presentation. The retired professor behind him gave him a thumbs up. That water filtration system could help thousands of people, he said encouragingly. Don't let today's incident overshadow your amazing work. Meanwhile, the videos continued to spread. A news producer in New York had picked up the story. A civil rights organization had already issued a statement. The airline's social media team was in crisis mode, responding to thousands of comments and messages. The kind flight attendant who had helped resolve the situation came by to check on the student. How's the presentation coming along? She asked warmly. Can I get you anything? Some juice, maybe. It's important to stay hydrated when you're nervous. The student managed a small smile. I'm okay, thank you, he replied. Just trying to stay focused on tomorrow's competition. His voice was steady now, stronger than before. The support from strangers had helped restore some of his confidence. A young mother a few rows back was explaining to her curious child what had happened. Sometimes people make mistakes because they judge others without knowing them, she said gently. But look how many people stood up to help. That's what really matters. As the plane began its initial descent into Atlanta, passengers started preparing for landing. The incident had created an unusual bond among them. Complete strangers were exchanging contact information, promising to follow up on the story, offering to attend the science competition to show support. Mrs. Thompson remained in the galley, mechanically going through her landing preparation checklist. Her hands shook as she received a message from the airline's HR department on her crew phone. She knew that once this flight landed, she would be facing consequences she'd never imagined when she started her shift this morning. The setting sun cast long shadows through the airplane windows, and as Atlanta's skyline appeared on the horizon, everyone on Flight 237 knew they had been part of something significant. A moment when ordinary people chose to stand up against bias, when a community formed in the most unlikely of places, and when a young scientist learned that for every person who might try to hold him back, there were dozens more ready to lift him up. As Flight 237 touched down in Atlanta, the aftermath of the incident was already in full swing. The moment the plane reached the gate, an airline supervisor in a crisp blue suit was waiting at the jet bridge. She had a concerned but professional expression on her face as passengers began to deplane. Mrs. Thompson, the supervisor said quietly, "Please come with me. We need to discuss what happened today." The once confident flight attendant now looked small as she gathered her belongings, avoiding eye contact with departing passengers. The young student was one of the last to leave the plane, carefully packing his laptop and presentation materials. As he stepped into the terminal, he was surprised to find several airline representatives waiting. "Sir, we want to sincerely apologize for your experience today," one of them said, handing him a business card. "Would you be willing to speak with our customer relations team?" Meanwhile, in the airline's Atlanta office, phones were ringing nonstop. The videos had gone beyond viral. They were now being picked up by major news networks. One clip had reached 5 million views in just 3 hours. Comments were pouring in from around the world, many sharing similar stories of discrimination during air travel. The airline's CEO had called an emergency meeting. On the conference room screen, they watched as more videos surfaced, each showing a different angle of the incident. "This isn't just about one flight attendant," the CEO said, rubbing his forehead. "This is about systemic issues we need to address." Back in the terminal, the business travelers who had witnessed everything were sharing their contact information with the student. "You focus on your competition tomorrow," said the businessman who'd been on the phone. "Let us handle this part. What happened today wasn't right, and we're going to make sure it's addressed properly." The child psychologist who had intervened on the flight was giving a statement to the airline's human resources team. "What concerns me most," she explained, "is how this kind of treatment affects young people's self-esteem and future aspirations. One negative experience can impact someone's entire life trajectory." In a small office near the gate, Mrs. Thompson sat across from the HR director and her supervisor. Her hands clutched a tissue as she watched the videos for the first time. Seeing her own behavior from the passenger's perspective was like looking in a mirror she'd been avoiding for years. I didn't realize," she stammered, watching herself on the phone screen. "I didn't see how I was acting." The HR director nodded slowly, sliding a document across the table. "You're being placed on immediate administrative leave," she explained. "We'll require you to complete our comprehensive bias training program before any discussion of reinstatement." Outside, the story continued to spread. A civil rights organization had already scheduled a press conference. Educational groups were reaching out to the student, offering support for his upcoming competition. The airline's social media team was working overtime, responding to thousands of comments and messages. The retired professor who had supported the student on the flight was now being interviewed by a local news station in the terminal. "What struck me most," he said, "was how this young man maintained his dignity throughout the entire ordeal. His water filtration project could help countless communities, yet he was treated like a criminal for simply asking to charge his laptop." In another part of the terminal, the kind flight attendant who had helped resolve the situation was filing her own report. "We need better training," she insisted to her union representative. "This isn't an isolated incident. We need to address these biases before they hurt more people." As evening fell over Atlanta, the impact of Flight 237 continued to grow. The airline had announced an immediate review of its training procedures. Civil rights activists were calling for industry-wide changes. But perhaps most importantly, thousands of comments were pouring in from people sharing their own stories, finally feeling brave enough to speak up about similar experiences. Mrs. Thompson left the airport alone that evening, her uniform covered by a jacket, her crew badge tucked away in her bag. As she waited for her ride, she watched another news crew setting up for a live broadcast near the terminal entrance. The weight of her actions and their consequences was finally sinking in. She realized that tomorrow would bring more scrutiny, more questions, and hopefully the beginning of real change, both for herself and for an industry that could no longer ignore these issues. The next morning dawned bright and clear in Atlanta. While Mrs. Thompson sat in a mandatory bias training session, her eyes were fixed on a news report playing silently on her phone. The young student she had confronted was on the screen, standing proudly next to his water filtration project at the National Science Competition. "Please put your phone away," the training facilitator said gently. "Let's focus on understanding what happened yesterday." The room was filled with other airline employees, all required to attend this emergency session. The atmosphere was tense but thoughtful. The facilitator played the videos from the flight again. This time, Mrs. Thompson didn't look away. She watched herself, really seeing her actions for the first time. The tone of her voice, the look in her eyes, the way she had towered over the student. Other attendees shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some recognizing similar behaviors in themselves. "What do you see now that you didn't see then?" the facilitator asked. The room fell silent. Mrs. Thompson's voice trembled as she finally spoke. I see someone who was afraid. Afraid of losing control, afraid of being wrong, afraid of—" She paused, tears forming in her eyes, afraid of changing times. Meanwhile, across town at the convention center, something remarkable was happening. The young scientist had just finished presenting his water filtration system to the judges. The room was packed, not just with competition officials, but with supporters who had heard about the flight incident. Several passengers from Flight 237 had shown up to cheer him on. The kind flight attendant who had helped him was there too, having taken her day off to attend. The business traveler who had spoken up sat in the front row, beaming like a proud uncle. As the student explained how his affordable filtration system could help communities access clean water, his voice grew stronger. Yesterday's incident had nearly shattered his confidence, but today, surrounded by unexpected support, he stood tall. Back in the training room, Mrs. Thompson was going through a series of eye-opening exercises. "Close your eyes," the facilitator instructed the group. "Think about a time when you were judged unfairly. How did it feel? Now, think about times you might have judged others without knowing their story." Her mind wandered to her own granddaughter, who was about the same age as the student. What if someone had treated her that way? The thought made her stomach churn. For the first time, she felt the full weight of what she had done. During the lunch break, Mrs. Thompson checked her phone again. The student's project had won first place. The news showed him accepting the award, surrounded by well-wishers. The reporter mentioned that several universities had already reached out about scholarship opportunities. "Your actions yesterday affected more than just one flight," the HR director told her during their afternoon meeting. "But how you choose to grow from this will affect countless future interactions." She slid a new document across the table, not a termination notice, but a chance at redemption through extensive training and community service. At the science competition, the celebration continued. The retired professor who had supported the student on the flight was explaining the water filtration system to a group of younger students. "See how one person's innovation can help thousands," he said, "and see how standing up against injustice can inspire others." The kind flight attendant who had helped resolve the situation approached the student with tears in her eyes. "You reminded all of us why we chose this profession in the first place," she said. "To help people, to bring out the best in each other." As evening approached, Mrs. Thompson sat alone in her car, thinking about everything she had learned. Her phone buzzed with another news update. The airline had announced major changes to their training programs. Her incident had sparked a nationwide conversation about bias in customer service. She opened her email to find hundreds of messages. Some were angry, yes, but others shared stories of their own journeys to overcome prejudice. One message caught her eye. It was from the child psychologist who had intervened on the flight. "Change is possible," it read. "The question is, are you ready to do the work?" Looking at the setting sun, Mrs. Thompson made a decision. This wouldn't be the end of her story. Instead, it would be the beginning of a new chapter. One where she would learn, grow, and hopefully help others avoid the same mistakes she'd had made. 3 months had passed since the incident on Flight 237. The airline's training center was buzzing with activity as Mrs. Thompson stood nervously in front of a room full of new flight attendants. She took a deep breath before speaking. "I'm here to share a story," she began, her voice softer than it used to be. "My story. Not as a victim, but as someone who had to face their own prejudices in front of the whole world." The room fell silent as she clicked to the first slide, a still image from that fateful flight. The young trainees watched intently as she played the viral videos. Some had seen them before. These clips had become part of airline training programs nationwide. But hearing the story from the person who lived it was different. They could see the pain in her eyes, the genuine remorse in her voice. I had to ask myself hard questions, she continued. Why did I react that way? What made me see a threat where there was only a young person trying to do their schoolwork? Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the podium, but her voice remained steady. In another part of the country, the Young Scientist water filtration project was being implemented in several communities. Local news stations covered the installation of the first system in a small rural town. This wouldn't have happened without that flight, he told reporters. Sometimes the worst moments lead to the best opportunities. Back in the training room, Mrs. Thompson shared what she had learned during her 3 months of intensive bias training. It's not enough to say, "I'm not prejudiced," she explained. We have to actively work to recognize and challenge our hidden biases every single day. She showed them statistics about discrimination in customer service, but then moved beyond the numbers. Each of these incidents is a real person, with real feelings, real dreams, real potential that might never be realized because someone like me decided they didn't belong. During the break, a young trainee approached her. My brother faced something similar last year, she shared quietly. He never flew again after that. Thank you for being honest about your mistakes. It helps us do better. Mrs. Thompson had received thousands of messages over the past months. Some were angry, others forgiving. But the ones that touched her most came from other airline workers who admitted they'd seen similar behaviors in themselves. Your story made me check myself, one wrote. Yesterday, I caught myself making assumptions about passenger, and I stopped. I remembered your video. The afternoon session focused on practical scenarios. Mrs. Thompson worked with the trainees on different situations they might encounter. Remember, she said, behind every passenger is a story we don't know. That young person I discriminated against, his invention is now helping hundreds of families access clean water. She showed them recent photos of the water filtration project's success. The young scientist hadn't let that day break his spirit. Instead, he had used the attention to gain support for his work. Several major companies had offered to help distribute his invention to communities in need. The hardest part, Mrs. Thompson admitted to the class, was watching my granddaughter's face when she saw the videos. She asked me why I was so mean to that boy. Children see the truth so clearly, don't they? Several trainees wiped away tears. As the training day ended, Mrs. Thompson checked her phone. There was a message from the child psychologist who had intervened that day. They had stayed in touch, working together to develop better training materials. Your willingness to change, the message read, is helping create real transformation in the industry. Walking to her car that evening, Mrs. Thompson remembered how she used to be, so sure of herself, so rigid in her views. Now, each day was a journey of learning and unlearning. The incident had cost her old job, but it had given her a new purpose. The setting sun painted the sky in gentle colors as she drove home. Tomorrow, she would do it all again, share her story, face the hard questions, help others learn from her mistakes. It wasn't always easy, but it was necessary. Because somewhere, on some flight, another young person with dreams and potential would board a plane. And maybe, just maybe, because of these training sessions, they would be treated with the dignity they deserved. 6 months after the incident on Flight 237, a special ceremony was taking place at the airline's headquarters. The Young Scientist's water filtration system was being honored, and the company had pledged to help transport the equipment to communities in need around the world. Mrs. Thompson stood at the back of the room, watching the ceremony with tears in her eyes. She hadn't seen the students since that day on the plane, but today would be different. She clutched a small envelope in her hands, containing words she had rewritten dozens of times. The room was packed with familiar faces. The kind flight attendant who had helped that day was there. The business travelers who had spoken up sat in the front row. The child psychologist who had intervened stood near the podium. Even some passengers from the original flight had come to witness this moment. Before we present this award, the airline's CEO announced, "We have someone who would like to speak." He gestured towards Mrs. Thompson. Her heart pounded as she walked to the front of the room. The young scientist, sitting in the front row, looked up at her with curious eyes. "6 months ago, I was a different person," she began, her voice shaking slightly. "I thought I was just doing my job, following rules. But I was wrong. So terribly wrong." She unfolded her letter but set it aside, choosing to speak from her heart instead. "To this brilliant young scientist," she said, turning to face him directly, "I owe you the deepest apology. But more than that, I owe you my gratitude. Your grace under pressure, your dignity in the face of discrimination, and your unwavering focus on helping others. These things changed me forever." The room was silent except for a few sniffles. The student's parents, sitting beside him, held hands tightly. His mother wiped away tears as Mrs. Thompson continued. "Because of you, thousands of airline employees have received better training. Because of you, our company has completely revamped its policies. Because of you, I discovered strength I never knew I had, the strength to face my own prejudices and work to change them." She gestured to the back of the room, where a group of flight attendants she had trained stood. "Every week, I share our story with new trainees. I show them the videos, not with shame anymore, but with hope. Hope that they'll learn from my mistakes. Hope that they'll do better than I did." The young scientist stood up and walked to the podium. Without a word, he extended his hand to Mrs. Thompson. The room erupted in applause as they shook hands, a simple gesture that symbolized so much more. "Your water filtration system is going to help so many people," she said softly. "And to think I almost stood in the way of that, just because of my own biases. I hope you can forgive me." The student smiled. "I forgave you months ago," he replied. "What matters is what we do next." He turned to address the crowd. "This isn't just about one flight or one incident. It's about how we treat each other every day. It's about seeing the potential in every person we meet." Together, they unveiled the airline's new initiative, a scholarship program for young scientists from underserved communities. Mrs. Thompson would serve on the selection committee, using her experience to ensure every applicant was treated with respect and dignity. As the ceremony ended, people gathered in small groups, sharing stories and hopes for the future. The child psychologist hugged Mrs. Thompson. "This is what real change looks like," she whispered. "Not just saying sorry, but working every day to make things better." Outside, the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant colors. Mrs. Thompson watched as the young scientist explained his invention to a group of eager children. Their eyes shined with possibility, untouched by the prejudices that had once clouded her own vision. Her phone buzzed with a message from her granddaughter. "Proud of you, Grandma. You showed us it's never too late to change." She smiled, thinking about how one moment on one flight had started a ripple effect that would touch countless lives. Tomorrow, she would be back in the training room, sharing their story with a new group of airline employees. But today, watching the young scientist inspire the next generation, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: pure, unbridled hope for the future.